Okay, so this is the first video in this series of videos that will cover topic 5.1, the Enlightenment. So this topic is going to be divided up into about 5 shorter videos that focus on explaining what the Enlightenment was and highlighting the new political, economic, and social ideas that it established. And then the last video will kind of summarize and, kind of bring everything back together. This video series also focuses on the information from chapter 5.1, which is pages 275 to 281. Now, you don't have to read this, but if you get confused on a section, you're more than welcome to go and read through that. So this first video focuses on introducing the topic. And within this topic, we have two main essential questions. First of all, we want to make sure we understand how the Enlightenment shaped the intellectual and the ideological thinking that affected both political and economic reform and revolution after 1750. So, in this question, we're talking about the foundation of the revolutionary activity, both economically and politically. We're also going to take some time to focus on the changes in social structures. The changes in social structures and the effects of the Enlightened ideas on them are probably the biggest effects because they lead to the most far reaching changes. Though the political and the economic changes are just as significant in the big picture, the degree of changes and the impact of the effects is going to be greater in the social structure. So, our task in answering these two essential questions, the very first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to define the Enlightenment and we're going to explain very briefly why it developed. In the second series of videos, video 2, 3, and 4, we're going to highlight the specific new political, economic, and social ideas. It's very important in this section that you associate idea with philosoph or philosopher. And then in the very last video, we're going to take a look at the big picture and explain the effects of this movement on the processes that rule people's lives. So, this is part of the modern age unit because this is going to be the results of the changing in worldview. In the first topic, 5.0, we looked at this picture and we established that it was either an old woman or a younger woman. But once we received an education focusing on the neckline and whether that was a mouth or that was a choker, people begin to change their views. This would be a similar situation. When you look at this, you probably see a black cup or a chalice. But if you zoom out a little bit, it also looks like two people in profile staring at each other. This is a similar situation. You see the gold cup, you see the old man and the old woman looking at each other, and then a little deeper introspection, we begin to see the gentleman playing the guitar and the lady listening to it. The bottom line is this is part of the modern age. And the modern age is about developing new political, economic, social, cultural processes using the empiric worldview. Now, when we begin to talk about the Enlightenment is going to specifically focus on three main areas. One will be political, one will be economic, and one will be social. The origin of the Enlightenment is focusing on the political systems. So this is a cover of a famous book by Thomas Hobbes called The Leviathan. And in the pages of the Leviathan, Hobbes writes about the support of an absolute monarch, a monarch of a maritime empire, or by extension, a land empire, who was all powerful. He argues in this book that people were nasty, brutish, and selfish and needed to be ruled by an all powerful ruler. So when we zoom in on the ruler on top, we see that, first of all, he's larger than life. But a little bit further inspection of this picture shows some very important other elements. One, that the leader, being larger than life, holds all the power, represented by the military sword in his right hand and the legal staff in his left hand. That he towers over areas such as the countryside, cities, and the church. And he is actually made up and supposed to represent all the people. What this shows us is that political systems prior to 1750 essentially appointed a person who was all powerful and could do, and usually did, what they wanted, what they felt was right for the ruling of the nation without really consulting or supporting the view of the people that he ruled. Well, people using empiricism studied this system. And as they grew smarter, they began to feel that, you know something, this system really doesn't make sense. This system really does not truly represent me as an individual, give me any rights other than being a member of the nation. And then finally, I don't really get to determine who I become and how I become it because everything's focused on the success of the monarch and the success of the nation. So this is where the Enlightenment comes in. The Enlightenment took the scientific empiricism, applied it to their worldview, and began to study the relationships of humans. First of all, politically, second of all, economically, and then third of all, socially. And studying these systems that existed before 1750, they found that it didn't make sense. So what the Enlightenment is, it's an 18th century intellectual movement that used empiricism. Remember, that's the study of the world using senses and rational thought to attack the traditional and religious-based political, economic, and social processes. Now, they just didn't criticize them. They also promoted processes in the same areas that promoted individualism, that promoted personal freedoms, and finally allowed people to determine their own life through self-determination. So what was the Enlightenment? What is this topic all about? It's focusing on this intellectual movement that used empiricism to attack traditional and religious-based political, economic, and social processes, and promoted new processes in those areas that promoted individualism, that promoted personal freedoms, and self-determination. And from this is where the modern political, the modern economic, and the modern social processes emerge from. So when we talk about the philosophs, and philosophs is the name of the philosophers who came up with these ideas. First of all, this was a middle class movement. As you can see by this picture, it was made up of educated middle class business people who wanted to basically create these new systems so their life could be better. Now, it wasn't an upper class movement because they had political systems that did all this. And it wasn't a lower class movement because the lower class did not have the education to think empirically. So the middle class, being rich from the age of exploration, being highly educated, began to really fight for political, economic, and social systems that promoted their individualism, meaning that promoted, their individual goals, their individual life, that gave them certain rights that were protected and couldn't be taken away, and allowed them to make choices to determine their own lives. So these ideas were very revolutionary. and essentially spread in many ways. There was a series of books called the Encyclopedia. This was edited by a guy by the name of Denis Diderot and were spread around France, England, and other areas in Western Europe, and allowed the philosophers to write articles and spread their ideas. These books were read at parties called salons, and debate took place about their contents. And in the new schools called academies, they taught the empiric worldview, and they did begin to teach these. But as governments saw these new ideas as threats, they cracked down on the encyclopedia, making it one of the most banned books in world histories. They cracked down on salons, and they closed academies. But the bottom line is that since the middle class was so big and so rich, and ultimately in the big scheme of things so powerful, these ideas began to take hold and eventually did spread to the upper and the lower classes. Again, all this is based on the empiric worldview, the use of rational thought and observations to gain knowledge, but also to use that knowledge to act. So, as I said before, when they looked at the absolute political system, starting in Western Europe, but eventually filtering into East Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they began to question it and they began to act against it because it didn't promote their individualism, it didn't protect their rights, and they couldn't determine their own rights. So, what are we learning within this topic? Well, first of all, we want to understand how the Enlightenment shaped the intellectual and ideological thinking that affected political and economic reform after 1750. Now, in this video, we focused on defining the Enlightenment. So, the Enlightenment shaped the intellectual and the ideological thinking by applying the empiric worldview to study human behavior, by looking at political, economic, and social systems, questioning them, and coming up with new systems in the same areas that promoted individualism, that promoted the protection of rights, and promoted self-determination. That these are going to allow for reform of the political, the economic, and the social systems changes. But since those in power didn't really want to change, it's also going to lead to revolutions. In the next series of videos, we're going to specifically look at the new political, economic, and social ideas.